The Dems cheating in 2020 had basically backfired for the deep state, and I think that's actually why they are panicking so much about what they saw on January 6th, 2021. I'm sorry. Um, the map that you're seeing here is resistance cells that have formed in the past 3 years that are ready to go to war. So, how did we get to this point? Good evening. My name is Anatoly Anatolisova, and this is Patriots Must Rise. Welcome to the bunker. Basically, throughout the years, we've just systematically kept electing some of the most retarded people on the planet and allowed them to destroy this country systematically. I have two clips that I'm going to share with you. One of them is a compilation of conservatives that are calling out the RNC for being so inept. Another one is a recording of an excerpt of Thomas Sowell's third chapter of his book, Social Justice Fallacies. And I really think that you need to pay attention to what he has to say, because I never thought of a lot of the stuff that he was saying. I always knew that the minimum wage never made sense, but I never once thought of it as being an intentional, weaponized form of racism towards the African American. But he calls it out very well. So let's get into this.
I'm on stage tonight. You want to look the GOP voters in the eye and tell them you resign. I will yield my time to you.
All right, joining me now, Ronna McDaniel, chairwoman of the Republican National Committee. Ronna, thanks so much for being with us. Vivek and others are saying that under your leadership, Republicans have lost election after election, and positing the question, why should you retain your job given the track record of the party under your leadership? And to that, what do you say?
Well, first, I'm going to continue to focus on Joe Biden and Democrats. And I think there was a moment missed during that debate by Vivek to talk about the fact that we still have 13 American hostages in Israel, the fact that for the first time ever in the history of either party, we had a Jewish co-sponsor for a debate, and we are in very perilous times in our country. And I do think Republican voters, and I hear this echoed all the time, are tired of the circular firing squad within our party. And they're saying, can we please talk about Joe Biden and the Democrats and the border and fentanyl and crime and what's happening to our kids and inflation. But I'll definitely defend my record as chair. Listen,
yeah, I mean, Ronna, I agree with you. Let me just say, I mean, all that you just said, I couldn't agree with more. But and you're right. I mean, obviously that should be a key focus. But I know you believe in accountability. You talk about it all the time. I mean, everyone. I mean, I'm accountable. So you're right.
Some accountability.
Okay, that's what I asked you, and you went into another, another
yeah, I was going to go there. Sorry, I took too long on the answer, but I was getting there. I'm not trying to avoid anything. Let me promise you that, Laura. Listen, when Vivek didn't vote in 2016, I was leading Michigan to the first win in history in 30 years. In 2018, we defied the odds. We got 3 senators, people like Josh Hawley, that allowed President Trump to build the largest conservative majority on the Supreme Court. In 2022, the RNC, which is a turnout machine, right? We're not the messengers. We don't create the messages for the campaigns. Those are the consultants who get very well paid.
Well, one of the things, though, Ronna, that happened was, I think in Virginia, people were wondering where the money was, whether they were going to get some help from the RNC. And I know at one point you said that you were not asked for money in Virginia, but a Republican source familiar with the Youngkin team in Virginia told The Angle late tonight that that is false. And meaning your story keeps changing. Anyone who thinks Virginia Republicans wouldn't want help when we knew we'd be outspent isn't being serious. You know, Ronna, they were outspent by $8 million.
Glenn Youngkin did a phenomenal job, and he raised a lot of money. A lot of people don't understand fundraising. I can't raise state dollars. I don't get unlimited convention and state dollars. And these were state House and state Senate races. The RNC is a federal committee. So, I mean, come on. Can you just, these are people who come after me all the time. They're on Twitter. They're all the time. And let's see their results. What did they do in Virginia? How much money did they give? But let me stand by something else. In 2022, we took back the House. And the RNC is part of that. We're building the road. And we're launching Bank Your Vote. We've got to do that.
Ronna, we got to roll, but thank you for joining us tonight. We have a lot more to get to next.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe.
There goes Ronna once again making up for, or trying to make up excuses for why Republicans are losing. Now, this is a phenomenon that has been going on for quite some time. Nobody seriously wants to tell the truth about what's going on at the RNC, though the truth has already been exposed. We now know all of the useless spending that was going on in the RNC, and we also know that they've been endorsing candidates that are not people that American conservatives wanted to actually see be nominated. They told us, well, if they're too conservative to win, we have to endorse the middle-of-the-road candidate. Time and time again, the people around Donald Trump, like Ronna McDaniel, pushed him to endorse certain people. They pressured him to think a certain way. Very, very strange things going on, though Ronna McDaniel and the RNC don't want you to know it. They don't want you to think about it. Well, guess what? Now, apparently, the RNC is losing more money than ever before. What does that say about the Republican Party? What does that say about what's going on in American politics as a whole? Well, a lot. A lot. Because it's not just the Republican Party that is failing, it's also the Democratic Party. Now, let me be clear. I don't consider myself a Republican, much like I don't consider myself a Democrat, because I believe there is a uniparty system that is working against us. I do consider myself a conservative who is rooted in conservative principles, and I don't believe the Republican Party represents those principles. Many of you are in the same boat. And so people like you and I, and probably even leftists that are sick and tired of the establishment wing of their party, the Democratic Party, we're sitting here looking around wondering who is really representing us. We talk a lot about how Republicans are losing, the RNCs screwing up right and left, or left and right, and they're doing everything wrong. But the reality is that nobody is winning. Nobody is winning. Not Republicans and not Democrats. They are doing the most bizarre, ridiculous things. You don't believe me? One of the first stories we're going to be discussing today. New York City bans discrimination against fat people. I'm sorry. What? I don't know about you, but the least of my concerns is the feelings of fat people in New York City while the Uniparty is forcing us to go to war to fight for a country that is not our own. I don't know about you, but I'm getting a little bit sick and tired when they try and tell us what our problems are. And the Democratic Party has been doing that for so long. But it's also the right. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party is failing. They are both failing Americans. Nobody is winning right now. And I know that sounds negative. But the two main groups of people that are supposed to represent us have utterly failed to do anything for any side. Because even if I were a Democrat who wanted to say my student loans forgiven, is the left doing that? Is Joe Biden doing that? No. Nobody is doing anything. This is a clown
show indeed. Our government has become nothing more than a bunch of retards that have overstayed their welcome. the detriment of their existence has actually become a topic that economists have written about for years. Thomas Sowell's social justice fallacies was written a decade ago. Okay, even before that simpleton Barack Obama got into office. So this is part of the third chapter of social justice fallacies. A link to the audiobook will be in the description. I sincerely suggest that you listen to the whole thing or buy the physical copy, because it will completely change how you look at what you see on the news. It might even make you smile a little bit when you watch those retards on the or that are talking to the screen. All right, so let's get into it.
Chess pieces fallacies. In much of the social justice literature, including Professor John Rawls's classic, A Theory of Justice,
This is
various policies have been recommended on grounds of their desirability from a moral standpoint, but often with little or no attention to the practical question of whether those policies could in fact be carried out and produce the end results desired.
Actually,
in a number of places, for example, Rawls referred to things that society should arrange, but without specifying either the instrumentalities or the feasibilities of those arrangements. It is hard to imagine what institution could take on such a gigantic task other than government. That in turn raises questions about the dangers of putting more power in the hands of politicians who run the government. The innocent-sounding word arrange cannot be allowed to obscure those dangers. Interior decorators arrange. Governments compel. It is not a subtle distinction. Governments must compel some things, ranging from traffic laws to laws against murder. But that does not mean that there are no dangers to be considered when expanding government compulsion for whatever seems desirable.
You're just extra.
That would mean destroying everyone's freedom for the sake of whatever crusade has caught the fancy of some influential segment of the population. Rawls's approach has by no means been unique to Rawls or even to modern times. Back in the 18th century, there were people with similar ideas. Adam Smith expressed his opposition to such people and to the very presumption of some doctrinaire theorist, a man of system, as he put it, who seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. The exaltation of desirability and neglect of feasibility, which Adam Smith criticized, is today still a major ingredient in the fundamental fallacies of the social justice vision. Its implications extend to a wide variety of issues, ranging from the redistribution of wealth to the interpretation of income statistics. The confiscation and redistribution of wealth, whether on a moderate or a comprehensive scale, is at the heart of the social justice agenda, while social justice advocates stress what they see as the desirability of such policies. The feasibility of those policies tends to receive far less attention, and the consequences of trying and failing often receive virtually no attention. There is no question that governments or even local looters can redistribute wealth to some extent. But the larger issue is whether the actual effects of attempting more comprehensive and enduring confiscation and redistribution policies are likely to be successful or counterproductive. Leaving moral issues aside for the moment, these are ultimately factual questions for which we must seek answers in the realm of empirical evidence rather than in theories or rhetoric. Redistribution of wealth. Politically attractive as confiscation and redistribution of the wealth of the rich might seem, the extent to which it can actually be carried out in practice depends on the extent to which the rich are conceived as being like inert pieces on a chessboard. To the extent that the rich can foresee and react to redistributive policies, the actual consequences can be very different from what was intended. In an absolute monarchy or a totalitarian dictatorship, a mass confiscation of wealth can be suddenly imposed without warning on the democratically elected government. Confiscatory taxation or other forms of confiscation must first be publicly proposed and then develop sufficient political support over time among the voters before being actually imposed by law. If millionaires and billionaires are not oblivious to all this, there is little chance that they will not know about the impending confiscation and redistribution before it happens. Nor can we assume that they will simply wait passively to be sheared like sheep. Among the more obvious options available to the rich, when they are forewarned of large-scale confiscations of their wealth, include 1. Investing their wealth in tax-exempt securities. 2. Sending their wealth beyond the taxing jurisdiction. Or 3. Moving themselves personally beyond the taxing jurisdiction. In the United States, the taxing jurisdiction can be a city, a state, or the federal government. The various ways of sheltering wealth from taxation may have some costs to the rich, and where their wealth is embodied in immovable assets such as steel mills or chains of stores, there may be little they can do to escape confiscation of these particular forms of wealth. But for liquid assets in today's globalized economies around the world, vast sums of money can be transferred electronically from country to country with a click of a computer mouse. This means that the actual consequences of raising tax rates on the rich in a given jurisdiction is a factual question. The outcome is not necessarily predictable, and the potential consequences may or may not make the planned confiscation feasible. Raising the tax rate X% does not guarantee that the tax revenue will also rise X% or will even rise at all. When we turn from theories and rhetoric to the facts of history, we can put both the explicit and the implicit assumptions of the social justice vision to the test. History. Back in the 18th century, Britain's imposition of a new tax on its American colonies played a major role in setting off a chain of events that led ultimately to those colonies declaring their independence and becoming the United States of America. Edmund Burke pointed out at the time in the British Parliament, "Your scheme yields no revenue. It yields nothing but discontent, disorder, disobedience." Americans were not just inert pieces on the great chessboard of the British Empire. American independence deprived Britain not only of revenue from the new taxes they imposed, but also deprived Britain of revenue from the other taxes they had already been collecting from the American colonies. This was by no means the only time when an increase in the official rate of taxation led to a reduction in the tax revenues actually collected. Tax rates versus tax revenues. Centuries later, similar withdrawals from taxing jurisdictions took place within the United States. The state of Maryland, for example, anticipated collecting more than $100 million in additional tax revenues by increasing the tax rate on people whose incomes were $1 million a year or more. But by the time the new tax rate took effect in 2008, the number of such people living in Maryland had declined from nearly 8,000 to fewer than 6,000. The tax revenues, which had been anticipated to rise by more than $100 million, actually fell instead by more than $200 million. Likewise, when Oregon raised its income tax rate in 2009 on people earning $250,000 a year or more, its income tax revenues also fell instead of rising. Americans were still not inert chess pieces. None of this has been peculiar to Americans, however. Similar things have happened when other countries raised or even threatened to raise tax rates substantially on high incomes in the expectation that this would automatically bring in more tax revenue, which it may or may not do. When such plans were advanced in Britain, for example, the Wall Street Journal reported, a stream of hedge fund managers and other financial services professionals are quitting the UK, following plans to raise top personal tax rates to 51%. Lawyers estimate hedge funds managing close to $15 billion have moved to Switzerland in the past year, with more possibly to come. Conversely, a reduction in tax rates does not automatically result in a reduction in tax revenues. People are not inert chess pieces in either case. Just as higher tax rates can repel people, businesses, and investments, lower tax rates can attract them. In Iceland, as the corporate tax rate was gradually reduced from 45% to 18% between 1991 and 2001, tax revenues tripled. In the United States, tax-exempt securities provide an obvious way for high-income people to avoid paying high tax rates. As the federal income tax rate rose sharply during the Woodrow Wilson administration, the number of people reporting taxable incomes of $300 or more declined from well over 1,000 in 1916 to less than 300 in 1921. The federal income tax rate on the highest incomes in 1920 was 73%. By 1928, the highest income tax rate had been reduced to 25%. Between those 2 years, the total amount of income tax revenue collected increased, and the proportion of all income taxes collected from people earning $1 million or more per year also increased, from less than 5% in 1920 to 15.9% in 1928. In advocating these tax rate reductions in the 1920s, Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon pointed out that the rich had vast sums of money invested in tax-exempt securities. These securities paid a lower rate of return than other securities that were subject to taxation. Investing in tax-exempt securities, despite their lower rate of return, made sense when the top tax rate was 73%. But at a top tax rate of 25%, it made sense for many high-income people to shift their investments to other securities that paid a higher rate of return, even though that return was subject to taxation. High-income people, not being inert chess pieces, figured this out. So, the federal government collected more tax revenue from them at the lower tax rate, because 25% of something is larger than 73% of nothing. Both Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon and President Calvin Coolidge said beforehand that a reduction of the tax rate would increase the tax revenue, as it did, and bring in more tax revenue from high-income people. Secretary Mellon had also complained that tax-exempt securities had created a situation that was repugnant in a democracy, namely, that there was, in effect, a class in the community which cannot be reached for tax purposes. Failing to get Congress to take steps to end tax-exempt securities, Mellon was at least able to get higher income people to pay a larger share of the income taxes by other means. Nevertheless, Mellon's arguments for reducing the top tax rate were denounced as tax cuts for the rich, as similar plans for similar reasons have been denounced ever since. For some, including distinguished professors at elite universities, the implicit assumption that tax revenues automatically move in the same direction as tax rates seems impervious to factual evidence. But such evidence is readily available on the internet from the official records of the Internal Revenue Service. Nevertheless, the chess pieces fallacy remains largely unchallenged. So, social justice advocates can continue to advocate higher tax rates on the rich on the basis of its desirability from their perspective, without regard to questions as to its feasibility as a revenue collection mechanism. In politics, highly expensive proposals to have the government provide various benefits free to everyone can be very appealing to some voters when the additional costs to the government are said to be paid for by collecting higher tax revenues from millionaires and billionaires, whether or not this actually turns out to be true. Such an outcome might seem desirable to some voters from a social justice perspective, but desirability does not preclude questions of feasibility. In politics, the goal is not truth but votes. If most voters believe what is said, the rhetoric is a success, as far as politicians are concerned. But from the standpoint of the public, the claim that the cost of government giveaways will be paid for by taxes collected from billionaires and billionaires is a proposition that very much requires empirical examination, since millionaires and billionaires are not always cooperative. People who imagine that the benefits they receive free from government will be paid for by others may discover that they themselves end up paying for those benefits as a result of inflation. The inflation tax. Just as tax rates on paper are not necessarily collected, so things that are not taxes can have the same effect as taxes. Inflation is one of those things. When tax revenues to pay for free benefits given to various groups fail to cover the expenses of those benefits, the government can get additional money needed to cover the deficit by issuing more government bonds and selling them. To the extent that these bonds are purchased in the market, the cost is passed on, with interest added, to taxpayers in the future. But if not enough of these bonds are bought in the market to cover the remaining deficit, these bonds can be purchased by the Federal Reserve System, a federal government agency legally authorized to create money. Then, as this additional money goes into circulation, the result is inflation. The net result of inflationary price increases is that everyone's money, regardless of their income, loses some of its value. It is the same as if a tax had been imposed on everybody, poorest to the richest, everyone paying the same tax rate on their money as millionaires and billionaires pay. But a tax on money is not a tax on tangible assets, such as factories or real estate, which increase in market value during an inflation. The net result of all this is that an inflation tax can take a higher percentage of the assets of the poorest people, whose money is likely to be a higher percentage of their total assets because they are less likely to own factories, real estate, and other tangible assets that rise in market value during an inflation. In short, an inflation tax is likely to be a regressive tax paid whenever buying groceries, gasoline, or other consumer goods at higher prices. The illusion of getting free benefits from the government may be maintained so long as the recipients do not see the connection between the higher prices they end up paying for what they buy after the government gives them free things. The biggest beneficiaries of this situation are
Liberals
likely
are
to
that
be
stupid.
politicians who can attract voters by offering them free benefits as a right, not a privilege, which the voters end up paying for in a roundabout way through inflationary price increases on the things they buy. Politicians cover their tracks by calling the key mechanism the Federal Reserve's creation of money to buy government bonds by the obscure insider phrase, quantitative easing, instead of saying in plain English that the government is producing its own money in order to pay for the things it is giving away free. Sometimes a technical sounding term, QE2, is used to designate a second round of creating money. That sounds so much more impressive than simply saying producing more money for politicians to spend. Chess pieces and price controls. Just as people's behavior changes when governments change tax rates, so their behavior changes when governments change the terms of other transactions. This is one of the most basic principles of economics. It has been known for centuries by economists, and even by others before there was any such occupation as an economist. But what has been known by some has not been known by all. So governments have been setting prices on various goods and services by law for thousands of years, going back to Roman times and even to ancient Babylon before that. Reactions to price controls. The people subject to price setting laws have seldom remained passive, as if they were inert chess pieces. How many governments understood this before they passed such laws is unknown. But what is known is that a president of the United States, Richard Nixon, who was fully aware of the adverse economic consequences of price controls, imposed those controls anyway. His response to criticism of that decision by economist Milton Friedman was, "I don't give a good goddamn what Milton Friedman says. He's not running for re-election." President Nixon was in fact re-elected by a larger majority than that which first put him in the White House. As for the economic consequences of the price controls, they were what such consequences have been in other places and times going back for centuries. At prices set by government below the level set by supply and demand, the amount demanded by consumers went up because of the artificially lower prices, and the amount produced by producers went down, also because of those same artificially lower prices. Neither consumers nor producers were inert chess pieces. The net result was that there were widespread shortages of food, gasoline, and numerous other things. But these consequences became widely apparent only after the election. None of this was peculiar to the United States. When the government of the African nation of Zimbabwe decreed drastic cutbacks in prices to deal with runaway inflation in 2007, the New York Times reported that citizens of Zimbabwe greeted the price cuts with a euphoric and short-lived shopping spree. But, as in the United States, this increase in the amount consumers demanded was accompanied by a decrease in the amount that producers supplied. Bread, sugar, and cornmeal, staples of every Zimbabwean's diet, have vanished. Meat is virtually non-existent even for members of the middle class who have money to buy it on the black market. Hospital patients are dying for lack of basic medical supplies. The people in Africa were not inert chess pieces any more than people in Europe or America. Many studies of many forms of price controls in countries around the world have revealed very similar patterns. This has led some people to ask, why don't politicians learn from their mistakes? Politicians do learn. They learn what is politically effective, and what they do is not a mistake politically, despite how disastrous such policies may turn out to be for the country. What can be a mistake politically
Is keeping a politician alive.
particular ideals, including social justice, can be something that society can just arrange through government without considering the particular patterns of incentives and constraints inherent in the institution of government. Minimum wage laws. Not all price control laws force prices down. Some price control laws force prices up. In these latter cases, producers produce more because of the higher prices, but consumers buy less. Again, people are not inert chess pieces in either case. While price control laws that force prices down tend to create shortages, price control laws that force prices up tend to create unsaleable surpluses. Rent control laws are examples of the former, and such laws have created housing shortages in cities around the world. Agricultural price support programs in the United States are an example of the latter, and they lead to farmers growing larger crops than the consumers will buy at the artificially higher prices. The unsaleable surpluses have led to expensive government programs to buy this surplus output and store it while figuring out how to dispose of it and limit future production. These costs run into many billions of dollars of the taxpayers' money. A special form of price control to force prices up are minimum wage laws, often supported by people with a social justice vision. Minimum wage laws are among the many government policies widely believed to benefit the poor by preventing them from making decisions for themselves that surrogate decision makers regard as being not as good as what the surrogates can impose through the power of government. Traditional basic economics, however, says that people tend to purchase less at a higher price. If so, then employers, not being inert chess pieces, tend to hire less labor at a higher price imposed by minimum wage laws than they would hire at a lower price based on supply and demand. Here, the unsaleable surplus is called unemployment. Although minimum wage rates are usually set by law at a level lower than what the average worker makes, these laws nevertheless tend to set wage rates higher than what an unskilled beginner would earn by supply and demand. in a freely competitive market. Therefore, the impact of a minimum wage law tends to be greater on young beginners, especially teenage workers, whose unemployment rates are especially relevant as tests of the economic principles, which suggest that minimum wage laws create higher rates of unemployment. With all the official statistics available, it might seem as if differences of opinion on the subject would have been resolved long ago. But over the years, vast amounts of ingenuity have been deployed, seeking to evade the obvious as regards the effects of minimum wage laws. Rather than elaborate and examine those arguments here, which have been elaborated and examined elsewhere, a few plain facts may be sufficient. In 1948, the unemployment rate in the United States for black 16-year-old males and black 17-year-old males was 9.4%. For their white counterparts, the unemployment rate was 10.2%. For black 18-year-old males and black 19-year-old males, their unemployment rate was 10.5%. And for their white counterparts, the unemployment rate was 9.4%. In short, there were no significant racial differences in unemployment rates among teenage males in 1948, while an unemployment rate of around 10% for young, inexperienced workers is higher than the usual unemployment rate among workers and the population at large. It was lower than usual for teenagers. More important for examining the effects of minimum wage laws on unemployment, these unemployment rates for teenage males were only a fraction of what unemployment rates for teenage males of both races would be from the 1970s onward, extending on into the early 21st century. Was there no minimum wage law in 1948? Was there no racism? Actually, there were both. But the federal minimum wage law, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, was a decade old in 1948, and the intervening years had such high rates of inflation that the minimum wage specified in 1938 was well below what even an unskilled teenage male beginner, such as myself in 1948, was paid in the devalued dollars of 1948. For all practical purposes, there was no effective minimum wage law. As Professor George J. Stigler, a leading economist of that era, said in 1946, the minimum wage provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 have been repealed by inflation. In 1950, however, there began a series of increases in the minimum wage rate over the years in order to keep up with inflation. The 1950s were the last decade in the 20th century in which black 16-year-old and 17-year-old males had annual unemployment rates below 10% in any years. In later decades of that century, the annual unemployment rate of black teenage males never fell below 20%. In some of those years, it ranged above 40%. Moreover, there was now usually a substantially higher unemployment rate among black teenage males than among white teenage males. In some years, the difference exceeded 2 to 1. Anyone who lived through those early years knows that there was more racism then than today. As late as 1950, public schools in Washington were explicitly segregated by race, and the General Accounting Office and some other federal agencies also had racially segregated employees, though not officially. Why then was there no significant difference in unemployment rates between black and white teenage males in 1948? A short, one-word answer is economics. Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman denounced the minimum wage laws as one of the most, if not the most, anti-black laws on the statute books. One of his students, Gary S. Becker, went on to win a Nobel Prize in economics for his landmark work that included an in-depth analysis of the economics of discrimination. The basic argument can be readily understood without the technical vocabulary of economists. Racism is an attitude inside people's heads and may cost racists nothing. But discrimination is an overt act out in the real world that can cost the discriminator either little or much, depending on economic circumstances. In a free competitive market with prices determined by supply and demand, discrimination can have serious costs to the discriminator. The minimum wage laws reduce the cost of discrimination to the discriminator. A wage rate set by government at a level higher than it would be set by supply and demand in a competitive market causes reactions by both workers and employers, as with other sellers and buyers who are not inert chess pieces. Higher wage rates attract more job applicants, but these higher costs of labor tend to reduce the amount of labor employers hire. The net result is a chronic surplus of job applicants for low-wage jobs affected by minimum wage laws. In these circumstances, employers who turn away qualified minority applicants can often readily replace them with other qualified people from the chronic surplus of job applicants. Discrimination under these circumstances may cost the employer nothing. When there is no minimum wage law or no effective minimum wage law, as in 1948, there is unlikely to be a chronic surplus of job applicants. Under these conditions, employers who turn away qualified minority applicants would have to either pay more to attract additional other qualified applicants to replace them, or else work existing employees overtime at higher overtime rates of pay, costing the employer money in either case. In these circumstances, it is not surprising that there was no significant difference in unemployment rates between black and white male teenagers in 1948, even though there was more racism then than in later years. Nor is it surprising that after a series of minimum wage rate increases over the years to offset inflation and make the minimum wage law effective again, a substantial racial gap in teenage male unemployment rates became common. So did much higher unemployment rates for teenage males of both races than what their unemployment rates had been in 1948, when wage rates were largely determined by supply and demand. In general, the cost of discrimination to the discriminator can vary considerably from one kind of economic activity to another, being higher for businesses in competitive markets where the employer's own money is at risk than among nonprofit organizations, regulated public utilities, and government agencies. History shows that these last three kinds of institutions have long been among the most discriminatory kinds of employers. It costs government discriminators nothing to discriminate because the costs are paid by the taxpayer. Similarly, for discriminators in nonprofit institutions where employers are likewise spending other people's money, the situation in government-regulated public utilities is somewhat more complicated, but the net result is that these public utilities' costs of discrimination can be passed on to their customers who have no choice but to pay when dealing with a government-regulated monopoly.
Stop. Okay, so Thomas Sowell's statement that that the minimum wage law is an inherently racist law for government makes total sense. But you have to actually get beyond the here and now. What is it that, and by that I mean somebody that's actually subject to the minimum wage is going to look at what their pocketbook looks like at the end of a pay period, but not necessarily look at what that minimum wage has done to how much they can buy, or whether or not they're going to be able to get a job when or if they lose the job they currently have. There are no good answers to this.
Derek over the border.
Okay, I'm recording. Okay, there's much discussion about the minimum wage and whether or not it's a valid argument. Thomas Sowell has made very valid arguments as to why it's never worked. But one thing that he doesn't bring up is the corruption of government that is pushing for the minimum wage and why they're pushing for it. When you receive that minimum wage, the tax codes have not changed. And that's intentional. Meaning that person that just got a bump up in their minimum wage is now in a different tax bracket. The government is giving themselves a raise. People need to think about that. But they also need to consider that that anything that the government tells you could benefit you, you should probably dismiss, maybe throw out with the trash, because they're the government. They are trash. That's all. I've worked for the government my entire life. There's never been any good public official. I mean, look at that racist piece of shit that the Democrats call a saint. Franklin Delano Roosevelt paid for the construction of Auschwitz-Birkenau out of his own pocket. But nobody even talks about that. Nobody talks about the fact that there are actually documented Polaroid pictures of a young Joe Biden in a Ku Klux Klan robe standing next to David Blaine in a cross-lighting ceremony, and Joe Biden is the one holding the torch. Nobody talks about that. Maybe we should. Maybe we should actually dissolve the parties and actually start voting for what is right instead of what the political narrative is. People are staying in poverty not because of a lack of desire or a lack of ambition. but because they believe government. They believe the whole crap about about taxing the rich, which ultimately reduces your wages. Anyway, I'm Anatoly Anatolizov. This is Patriots Must Rise. I thought it would be a very beneficial episode if I just let Thomas Sowell basically run with it. I hope that somebody actually gained some knowledge and benefited from the arguments that he made. I'm not an economist, but everything that he said made sense to me. The links to his books are in the description. I choose to use Audible for a lot of reasons, mostly my vision. But also I can walk around and be doing stuff with a earbud in my ear and be listening to whatever he might be saying and actually learning something while I'm doing something mundane at work. So that's why the links are Audible audiobooks. Anyway, until next time, live free, die well, love your neighbor as Christ has loved you. Please like and subscribe. The links that I'm talking about are in the link to the newsletter. That is the citations for this podcast. All clear, sir.